The old champion had killed 41 worlds, and not one of them by his own hand. He killed them the way the Ascendancy always killed. He challenged them. He walked into their throne halls, into their council chambers, into their proud little parliaments, and he laid the iron token on the floor, and he said the words every species in the inner dark had learned to fear. Stand and answer, or kneel and be ruled. That was the whole law of the Vorthan Ascendancy, the law that had held for 9,000 years. You did not invade a world, you challenged it. You sent your finest hull against its finest hull, one ship against one ship, in the empty black where the stars could watch, and whoever was left when the slag cooled, owned everything the loser had ever loved. His name was Garrick Vale, and the council had a longer name for him, a title with 7 syllables that meant, hand that never loses. He had stood in 206 challenges. He had never knelt. His personal hull, the verdict of the 9th spire, had a kill mark for every challenge etched into her bow, and the etchings ran so deep now that her armor was thinner there than anywhere else, and he was proud of that thinness, the way a soldier is proud of a scar. The verdict was old steel. She had been new when Garrick was young, 600 years past, and in those 600 years she had carried 3 champions before him and outlived all 3. And now she carried the 4th and the last, and her etched bow read like a history of the inner dark. Each kill mark was a world. Each world was a people who had stood and answered and lost, and handed over everything, and learned to live under the Ascendancy's quiet hand, paying their tribute, sending their young to the arena schools, learning to call the thing that had ruled them honor, because the alternative was to call it what it was. Garrick had read the marks on his own bow 10,000 times. He had never once thought to wonder what the marks looked like from underneath. That was a thing the old champion had never done. He had spent 340 years on top of the dark, and the dark had a bottom he had never seen, and he did not yet know that he was about to be shown it. He was old now, 340 years old, which was old even for a Vorthan, and the Vorthan lived long. His joints ached in the cold of the arena station. His second heart skipped, the failing one slower every season, so that the medics had begun to speak to him, in the soft, careful voices they used for champions, whose last challenge was behind them. He had retired to the slag moon of Hesh, a gray rock the Ascendancy had cracked open and emptied of its metal long ago, and he had thought he would die there, looking at the place where 2 of his 41 worlds had been mined to nothing, and he had thought that would be a fitting end for the hand that never loses, to die looking at his own work. And he had been brought out of that quiet retirement, brought back into the cold white light of the Hall of Challenges, for one reason only. A new world had appeared at the edge of the map, a small, loud, ugly little world, far out past the ribbon, in a quarter of the dark the Ascendancy had never bothered to chart, because there was nothing out there worth charting, and this small, loud world had done something no world had ever done in 9,000 years. It had refused the challenge. Not lost it, refused it. The Ascendancy had sent a challenger, as the law required. A proper challenger, a ship called the Spear of Correct Order, 11 kilometers of honed Vorthan war steel, the kind of hull that had ended 100 proud species before they finished reading the demand. The spear had warped into the small world's sky and laid down the iron token and spoken the words, "Stand and answer, or kneel and be ruled." And the small world had answered, but not with a champion. It had answered with a question. The transmission was 3 words long, in a language the Ascendancy's finest minds had needed 40 days to even begin to parse, and when they finally cracked it, the council had gone very quiet, because the 3 words were these. Which one first? That was all. Which one first? As though the single 11-kilometer warship that had come to end them was not a threat, but a line in a queue. As though there were a list. As though the small, loud world had looked up at the Spear of Correct Order, the pride of the Ascendant Fleet, and seen not a challenger, but the first name on a sheet of paper that ran on for a very long time. The Spear of Correct Order did not return. It was not destroyed. That was the thing the council could not say aloud, the thing that made the oldest of them refuse to sleep. The spear was not destroyed. It simply never came home on its own, and it never answered the recall, and when the second ship was sent to find it, the second ship found the spear exactly where it had warped in, intact, unmarked, every plate whole, drifting with her engines cold, and her crew of 900 sitting at their stations, alive, breathing, staring out the forward viewports at the small, loud world, and not one of them would say a word about what they had seen. Not one. They came home and they sat in the debriefing halls and they would not speak, and 3 of them stopped eating, and the rest asked, very quietly, to be sent somewhere they could not see the stars. Garrick Vale had spoken to one of them himself, before the council showed him anything else. A young weapons officer named Korath, who had stood in no challenges of his own, who had been on the spear only because the spear was the pride of the fleet, and the pride of the fleet was where the young and ambitious wanted to be. Korath sat across a small table from the hand that never loses, and the old champion, who had broken proud kings with a sentence, used every soft skill he had learned in 340 years to coax the truth out of a frightened boy, and he got exactly 4 words. Korath looked at the table, and his hands were very still, and he said, "It let us go." And then he said nothing more, not that day and not ever. And when Garrick pressed him, gently, on what it was, and what letting them go had cost, the young officer only looked up at him with an expression the old champion had made on hundreds of faces, and had never once received, and Garrick understood that the boy was not refusing to answer. He was answering. The expression was the answer. It said, "You have spent your whole life being the thing that does not let people go. You would not understand the gift of being let go by something that could keep you." And Garrick Vale, 340 years old, sat across the small table from a boy a fifth his age, and felt, for the first time in a very long while, that he had been told something true and could not parse it. So the council had brought Garrick Vale out of retirement. They had brought the hand that never loses to the great hall of challenges, the hollow ringed station at the center of the ascendancy, where every challenge for 9,000 years had been judged, and they had shown him the readouts, and the silence of the spear's crew, and the 3 words, and they had asked him the only question that mattered. The Hall of Challenges was the holiest place in the inner dark, and Garrick Vale had not set foot in it in 11 years, since the day he had judged his last challenge and retired. It was a hollow ring of black stone and old steel, 40 kilometers across, built around a captured star that the early ascendancy had hauled out of a dying system and chained at the center of the ring 9,000 years ago, so that every challenge judged there would be lit by a sun the ascendancy had taken and held. That was the whole message of the hall, written in its bones. "We took a star. We hold it still. What chance have you?" 40 species had knelt in that hollow ring across the centuries, and their thrones and their crowns and their broken tokens hung along the inner wall, a gallery of everything the ascendancy had ever made bow, and Garrick Vale had walked that gallery as a young champion and felt the cold pride of it, and he walked it now as an old one, and felt, for the first time, something he could not name, a small, cold question underneath the pride, a question that the 3 words from the small, loud world had put there. Which one first? As though all of it, the captured star, the gallery of crowns, the 40 knelt species, were not an ending but a beginning, a list, the first entries on a sheet of paper that ran on for a very long time. Will you stand against it? And Garrick Vale, who had killed 41 worlds without ever lifting a hand against them, who had broken proud species by simply walking into their halls and making them understand what was coming, looked at the readouts for a long time. He looked at the small, loud world. He looked at its single gray warship. And the old champion, for the first time in 340 years, did not answer right away. Because the readouts were wrong. That was his first thought, the thought of a creature who had spent his whole life trusting instruments. The numbers the spear had brought back were wrong, or corrupted, or invented by frightened minds. They had to be. No hull put out a reading like that. No drive in the charted dark folded space the way the small world's single ship folded it. The ascendancy measured a warship's worth in 9 ways, by mass and by output, and by the depth of its guns, and by 6 other holy figures, and the small gray ship from the small loud world did not register on any of the 9. Not high, not low. It simply was not on the scale. The instruments looked at it and returned, the one answer instruments are never supposed to return. They returned nothing. Garrick Vale had seen frightened crews before. He had made hundreds of them, across 2 centuries, and he knew the difference between a crew that had seen a stronger enemy and a crew that had seen something the universe had no shelf for. The crew of the Spear of Correct Order was the second kind. He could read it in the way they sat. They had not lost a fight. They had been shown a thing. He set down the readout. He looked at the council, at the 12 oldest minds in the ascendancy, the keepers of the 9,000-year law, and he saw that they already knew the answer, and only wanted him to say it so they would not have to. So he said it. He said, "No." He said, "I will not stand against it." And the Hall of Challenges, which had not heard those words from any champion in 9,000 years, went so quiet that Garrick Vale could hear his own two hearts, the strong one and the failing one, beating out of time. The council did not accept his refusal. Of course they did not. The law did not allow it. There was a thing they did not say to outsiders, a thing buried under the 9,000 years of ritual, and the etched bows and the iron tokens. The challenge was not really a duel. It looked like a duel. It was dressed like a duel, with its single hulls and its empty black and its watching stars, but it was a machine for making the whole galaxy kneel, without the ascendancy ever having to pay the cost of a true war. You sent one ship, the other world sent one ship. The world that lost handed over everything, not because it had to, but because the challenge was holy, because 9,000 years of every species agreeing to its terms had made losing the challenge feel like losing the right to exist. The ascendancy had 211,000 warships. It had never once needed to use more than one at a time. The fear did the rest. There was a history under the law that few outside the council ever learned, and Garrick Vale had been told it only when he became a champion. 300 years passed, in the deep chamber beneath the hall where the oldest truths were kept. The challenge had not always been bloodless. In the first centuries of the ascendancy, it had been a true duel, ship against ship, fought to the death, and the early champions had died in their hundreds, and so had the worlds that resisted, and the dark had run red. It had taken 400 years for the ascendancy to learn the thing that made it great, which was that you did not actually need to fight. You only needed everyone to believe that you would, and that you would win. Once that belief became total, once every species in the inner dark had watched enough worlds kneel, the fighting stopped almost entirely. A challenger would warp in, lay down the token, speak the words, and the challenged world would look at the etched bow and the long roll of marks and simply concede, because the marks were a promise, and the promise had never once been broken. Garrick Vale had fought, in 206 challenges, perhaps 30 true battles. The rest had knelt at the sight of him. He was not, by the end of his career, a warrior at all. He was a symbol, and the symbol did the killing, and the killing was the kneeling, and the kneeling was bloodless. That was the genius of the law. It was also the flaw in it, because a symbol works only as long as everyone agrees to be afraid of it, and the small, loud world out past the ribbon had simply, quietly, declined to be afraid. And the fear only worked if the challenge was never refused. If one small, loud world out past the ribbon could simply say which one first and send the pride of the fleet home full of silent men, then the whole 9,000-year machine cracked, all at once, everywhere. 41 of Garrick Vale's worlds would remember that they had been beaten by a ship and a ceremony, and not by an army. They would start to do the arithmetic. They would start to count their own hulls against the ascendancies, and they would notice, as the ascendancy had always prayed they would never notice, that the numbers were not so far apart, that the challenge had always been a bluff held together by belief. So the council could not let it stand. They told Garrick Vale this, in the plain ugly language they used only among themselves. They told him the ascendancy did not need him to win. They needed the small, loud world to die in the proper way, in front of witnesses, so the ceremony held. They needed a champion to stand on the field and lose, if it came to that, so that the galaxy could be told it had been a fair challenge, and humanity had simply cheated, broken the holy law, murdered an honorable hull. They could work with a martyr, a refused challenge they could not survive. They were asking him to die so the lie could live. He understood the shape of it completely, because he had spent his life inside that shape. The challenge had never been about strength. He saw that now, sitting in the hollow hall, hearing the council say it plainly for the first time in 200 years of his service. A world that lost a challenge did not lose because the ascendancy was stronger. Half the worlds Garrick had brought low had fleets that could have ground the verdict of the Ninth Spire into dust if they had simply ignored the ceremony and swarmed her with everything they had. they never did. They sent one ship, as the law required, and they lost it. And they knelt, because 9,000 years of every species agreeing to the terms had made the terms feel like the shape of the universe itself. The challenge was a story the whole inner dark told together, and the story only held because no one had ever stopped telling it. The Ascendancy's 211,000 warships were real, but they were not the weapon. The weapon was the agreement, and the small, loud world out past the ribbon had simply, quietly, declined to agree. Garrick Vale was 340 years old. He had killed 41 worlds. And he found, sitting in that hollow hall, that he did not want to be the martyr in the Council's story, but he found something stranger underneath that. Something he had not felt since he was very young, and had not yet learned that the challenge was a machine. He found that he wanted to see it, the thing the Spear's crew had been shown. The thing with no shelf. He had spent 300 years certain that he had measured the whole of the dark, weighed it, won it, and now there was a reading that returned nothing, and an old hunger woke in him that he had thought long dead, and it was not the hunger to win. It was the hunger to be surprised. So he said yes after all, but not the way they wanted. He said he would go to the small, loud world. He would carry the iron token, as the law required. He would stand on the field, but he would go alone, in his own old hull, the verdict of the ninth spire, with no shadow fleet hiding behind the ribbon to finish what he could not. If the ceremony was to hold, it would hold honestly, one ship against one ship, or it would not hold at all. The Council did not like it, but a champion who set his own terms was older law than the Council itself, and they could not refuse him without admitting the whole thing was a sham, so they let him go. The verdict of the ninth spire warped out from the Hall of Challenges with a single crew of 110, all of them old, all of them volunteers, all of them champions of smaller challenges in their own right, who had asked to stand with the hand that never loses, one last time. There was Tovesh, who had stood in 19 challenges at the censors, and had read the weakness in every hull the verdict ever faced. There was old Drev at the guns, who had not missed a firing solution in 200 years, and who said little and meant all of it. There was the navigator Sashka, the youngest aboard at 90, who had begged her way onto the crew because she wanted to see the edge of the charted dark before she died, and who would, before the voyage ended, see a great deal more than the edge. They were the last champions of a dying art, the finest minds the challenge had ever produced, and every one of them had come because the law that had made them was about to meet the one thing it had never met, and they would rather stand in its sky than read about it. They crossed the ribbon, the great band of dark dust and old wreckage that the Ascendancy had used for 9,000 years, as the edge of the map, the place past which there was nothing worth charting. They crossed the long empty quarter no one had charted. 9 days of folded space and silence. 9 days in which Garrick Vale did not sleep well, because every time he closed his eyes he saw the boy Koreth's face and heard the 4 words, "It let us go," and could not make them mean anything his life had a shelf for. On the 9th day they came into the sky of the small, loud world, and Garrick Vale looked at it with his own eyes for the first time, and he understood at once why no one had bothered to chart it. It was a poor world. A blue and brown and gray world, with too much water, and too thin an air, and a single ugly gray moon, and around it, not a fleet, not a fortress, not a shining ring of war steel. One ship, one single gray warship, hanging in a slow orbit, doing nothing, saying nothing, putting out no signal, no challenge, no boast. It was 22 kilometers long. That was the first wrong thing, because no one built hulls that long. The engineering did not hold. A hull that long should fold under its own drive stress and snap like a reed, and yet there it hung, whole and gray and patient, twice the length of the spear of correct order, twice the length of anything in the Ascendant fleet, and somehow not the largest wrong thing about it. The largest wrong thing was that the verdict's instruments, the Holy Nine, looked at the gray ship and returned nothing. Garrick Vale had not believed the spear's crew. He had told himself their instruments were broken. Now his own instruments, the finest in the fleet, freshly calibrated, looked at the 22-kilometer ship in the small world sky, and the mass reading climbed and then simply stopped reporting. Not zero, not error, just a flat, empty channel where a number should be, as though the ship were not refusing to be measured, but as though the act of measuring it had nowhere to go. As though you had asked the dark how heavy it was. His sensor chief, an old female named Tovish, who had stood in 19 challenges of her own, looked up from her station, with an expression he had not seen on a Vorthan face in 200 years. It was not fear. He almost wished it were fear. Fear he knew. This was the look of someone whose certainty had just been quietly taken away, and who had not yet decided what to put in the empty place. "It does not weigh anything," she said. Then she corrected herself, slowly, like a creature feeling along the edge of a cliff in the dark. "No, it weighs everything. The number does not stop because the ship is light. It stops because the instrument runs out of numbers before the ship runs out of mass." She tried the other 8 holy figures, the depth of its guns, the heat of its drives, the shape of its fold wake, all the ways the Ascendancy had learned across 9,000 years to know a warship before it ever fired. The gray ship returned nothing to any of them, not a gun throat anywhere on its hull, not a heat bloom from any drive, not a single fold line in its wake, as though it had not crossed space to reach its own orbit, but had simply always been there. Tovesh, who had read the weakness in 206 hulls and never once been refused an answer, sat at her station and found, for the first time in a long life, that there was a thing in front of her that her instruments could not see at all, and that the not seeing was itself a kind of answer, and that the answer was worse than any number. A ship you cannot measure is a ship you cannot fight, because to fight a thing you must first know where it is weak, and the gray ship had no weakness because it had no shape the Holy Nine could hold. Garrick Vale said nothing. He looked at the gray hull, and he felt the old hunger sharpen into something close to joy and close to dread, and he could not tell the two apart, and he was old enough to know that meant he was finally awake. He gave the order. He had the iron token prepared, the heavy black disk that had laid 41 worlds low, and he had it loaded into the ceremonial launcher, and he had Tovesh open the old band, the challenge band, the one frequency that every species in the charted dark had agreed 9,000 years ago to always keep open, so that no world could ever claim it had not heard the words. And he spoke them himself, in his own old voice, the words he had spoken 206 times, and never once heard answered. "Stand and answer," he said, "or kneel and be ruled." For a long moment, the small, loud world said nothing. The gray ship did not move. The iron token drifted out from the verdict's launcher and hung in the black between the two hulls, slowly turning, catching the weak light of the small world's sun. Then the gray ship answered, and it did not answer with 3 words, the way it had answered the spear. It answered with 1. It said, "Welcome." And every instrument on the verdict of the 9th spire, the Holy Nine and the Lesser 100, every gauge and every screen, went dark at once, all together, soft and clean, the way a hall goes dark when a single hand finds the master switch. Not damaged, not attacked, off. And in the dark, before the emergency lights came up, before anyone could draw breath, the gray ship spoke again, into the bridge, into the air itself, without any radio, in the old challenge tongue spoken better than any Vorthan alive could speak it. It said, "You came alone. Good. The others always bring a fleet behind the ribbon, and pretend they did not. You did not, so I will show you, instead of the others, the thing they would not have understood." And then the lights of the verdict came back, all of them, gently, and every instrument woke, and the Holy Nine reported again, calm and normal and correct, as though nothing had touched them. And Garrick Vale understood that he had just been shown, in the space of 4 seconds, that the gray ship could reach into the most defended hull in the Ascendant fleet, and turn it off and on like a child's lamp, and had chosen, instead of killing him, to simply demonstrate that it could, and then to give him his ship back. It was the giving back that undid him, sitting there on his own bridge. He had spent 340 years studying the moment when a world understood it had lost, the exact moment, the way the eyes went, the way the proud voice cracked, the way a king who had ruled 1,000 years found out in a single breath that he ruled nothing. He had collected those moments the way other creatures collect coins, and he understood, now, with a cold, clean clarity, that the gray ship had just put him in that moment, had shown him in 4 seconds that his ship and his fleet and his 9,000-year law were a child's lamp it could switch at will, and then had done the thing he had never once done in any of his collected moments. It had not pressed the advantage. It had not taken the throne. It had given the lamp back, lit, working, and had said welcome, and the welcome was not mockery, the old champion realized. The welcome was simply true. The welcome was a thing offered by a creature that did not need anything from him, and had decided, for reasons he did not yet understand, to be kind. And nothing in 340 years had prepared the hand that never loses for kindness, from a thing he could not beat. He had a shelf for cruelty. He had a shelf for fear. He had no shelf at all for this. That was when the old champion understood what the Spear's crew had been shown. They had been shown the difference between a thing that wants to win and a thing that has nothing left to prove. He had spent 340 years being the second kind of thing for everyone else. Now, for the first time, he was on the other side of it. Tovesh looked at him across the bridge, and she did not have to ask the question, because it was written in the slack of her jaw and the stillness of her hands. Do we run? Do we fight? Do we kneel? What does the hand that never loses do when he meets the thing that cannot lose? And Garrick Vale, 340 years old, 41 worlds on his bow, 206 challenges unbroken, did the one thing no champion of the Ascendancy had ever done. He opened the challenge band himself, and he spoke to the gray ship, and instead of the words of the law, he asked it a question. He asked, what did the others not understand? The gray ship took a long time to answer, and Garrick Vale understood that the slowness was a courtesy, not a hesitation. It was giving him time to be sure he wanted to know. When it spoke, it gave its own name first, which no human ship had ever done in any challenge. It said, I am called the Last Tribute. It said the name the way an old creature says a thing it has carried for a long while. And then, it answered his question. The others, it said, came to win. Every challenger the Ascendancy ever sent, across 9,000 years, came to my sky, and my world's sky, and 100 other skies, and they came to win, because winning was the only shape their minds had room for. They laid down the iron token, and they spoke the words, and they waited for me to choose between standing and kneeling, because those were the only two doors they had ever built. And when I did not take either door, they did not understand what they were looking at. They thought I was a stronger fighter. They went home silent because they had been beaten, and being beaten was a thing they could survive, a thing they had a shelf for. The Spear of Correct Order went home silent because I let it go home, and a crew that has been spared by something it cannot measure does not have words, only the long quiet afterward. But you, the Last Tribute said, you asked a question. In 9,000 years and 206 challenges, you are the first champion of the Ascendancy to stand in my sky and ask, instead of demand. So I will tell you the thing the others could not have held. I am not a stronger fighter. There is no fight. There was never going to be a fight. I came here to make sure of it. Garrick Vale said, came here. From where? And the Last Tribute showed him. It did not speak it. It showed it, the way it had shown the Spear's crew, except that the Spear's crew had been shown and broken, and Garrick Vale was being shown and trusted, and the difference, he would understand much later, was the asking. The bridge of the verdict of the ninth spire filled with a light that was not light, and the old champion saw. He saw the small, loud world as it had been, long ago, before it was loud. He saw it green and whole and unguarded, a young world that had only just learned to cross its own dark, with no fleet and no challenge, and no idea that the Ascendancy or anything like it existed. And he saw the thing that had come for it, not the Ascendancy, something older and worse, something the Ascendancy itself had never met and would not have survived meeting, a thing that did not challenge, and did not parley, and did not leave crews alive to go home silent. A thing that came in numbers past counting, a tide of black hulls without etchings or tokens or words, that fell on the green world and burned its sky and salted its soil and took, in the space of a single turn of that world around its star, 4 billion of its people, not as conquest, not as challenge, but as harvest. The way a fire takes a field, without hatred, without honor, without the small mercy of an enemy who wants you to kneel, because kneeling implies you are worth ruling, and the thing that came did not think the green world was worth ruling. It thought the green world was fuel. He saw it not as numbers but as a single street. The last tribute was careful about that. It did not show him 4 billion as a figure, because a figure was a thing a fire could survive. The way the council had survived the silence of the spear, by turning it into a line in a report. It showed him one street on the green world, on an ordinary morning, before the tide came. It showed him a creature carrying water, and another creature mending a roof, and 3 small ones chasing each other between the buildings, loud and quick, and certain that the morning would be followed by an afternoon. And then it showed him the sky going wrong, and the loud, quick small ones going still, and the water spilling on the stones, and the roof unmended forever, and it held the street there, just the one street, until Garrick Vale understood that there had been 4 billion streets, 4 billion mornings, and that every kill mark on the bow of the verdict of the 9th spire was a street like this one, seen from above, by a champion who had never once let himself look down. Garrick Vale watched 4 billion people die in the false light on his bridge, one street at a time, and he had killed 41 worlds, and he had never once seen what it looked like from underneath, and he found that his old failing heart had stopped beating entirely for the length of the showing, and only began again when it ended. And when it began again, it beat differently, the old champion would say later, in the slow years that followed. Not weaker, not stronger, differently. The way a stone sits differently in the bed of a river after the flood has moved it. And the last tribute said, "That is where I came from. We were the green world. We had no champions, and no fleet, and no 9,000-year law. We had 4 billion people, and a thin air, and too much water, and we lost almost all of it in a single year, to a thing that did not even know we were sentient. And the ones who were left, the few 100 million who survived in the deep places, and the cold places, and the far places, made a choice that your ascendancy has never had to make, because your ascendancy has always been the fire, and never the field. We chose to become a thing that could never be harvested again. Not a stronger fighter, not a bigger fleet. A thing with no shelf, a thing that the tide could look at and find us no number for, so that when it came back, and it did come back, it would look at us and return nothing, and turn, and go and find an easier field. It took us 4,000 years, the last tribute said. We are very patient now. We learned patience the way you learn it, by surviving the thing that should have ended you. 4,000 years is a long time to a fire, and no time at all to a field. In those 4,000 years, we did not build a fleet, because a fleet is a thing the tide could count, and a thing that can be counted can be matched, and a thing that can be matched can be burned. We built something the tide could not count. We did not make ourselves stronger. We made ourselves unmeasurable. We taught the very space around our world to refuse to report what it held, the way Tovesh's instruments refused just now, so that when the harvester returned, the second time, it looked at the place where 4 billion of us had died and it found, where it expected a recovering field, nothing it could weigh, nothing it could hold, nothing it could fuel itself on. And it was confused, the way a thing that has never been confused is confused, and it went away to think. And when the tide came back, the third time, sure of itself again, certain it had simply misread, we did to it what I did to your instruments 4 seconds ago. We turned it off, gently, all of it, the whole harvest. Every black hull in numbers past counting, switched off in the dark above our world, not burned, not killed, because killing was the tide's idea, and we were done with the tide's ideas. Just switched off, and held off, and shown, in a language even a harvester could parse, that this field returned nothing, and never would. And it has not come back since, and it will not. Because there is nothing here it can hold, and nothing here it can measure, and a harvester does not return to a field that returns nothing. Garrick Vale sat with this for a long time. The false light had faded. The Holy Nine reported normally. The iron token still drifted in the black between the two hulls, slowly turning, and it looked, now, very small. There was a silence on the bridge of the verdict, and into it, the old champion asked the thing a champion asks, because 340 years had built him to ask it, and he could not help himself. He asked, "Then why does it matter what I do? If you turned off a harvester in numbers past counting, a thing older and worse than the whole ascendancy, then my 211,000 hulls are nothing to you, less than nothing, a handful of sparks to a creature that put out a sun. You could end us in an afternoon. Why the ceremony? Why answer my law? Why not simply turn us off, the way you turned off the tide, and be done? And the last tribute said, because turning you off would teach the dark nothing, and the dark is what I came to teach. If I switch off your ascendancy the way I switched off the tide, then I have only proven that there is always a larger fire, and the next thing the inner dark will do is go looking for a fire larger than me, and the kneeling and the burning will go on forever, only with new names. I did not cross the long empty quarter to be the new top of the dark. I crossed it to take the top off the dark entirely. There is a difference between winning the game and ending it, and a fire can only ever imagine winning, and so a fire, no matter how large, only ever makes more fire. I am not here to win your challenge. I am here to be the last move in a game that has gone on 9,000 years too long, and you cannot end a game by force, because force is the game. You can only end it by making everyone watching understand, all at once, that it was never worth playing. And for that, I do not need to destroy you. I need a witness who asked a question. I need you, he said. Then why are you here? If the tide is gone, if your world is safe, why does a thing with no shelf come to my sky and answer my law and call itself a tribute? And the last tribute said the thing that the old champion would carry to the end of his days. It said, because we remember being the field. Your ascendancy has spent 9,000 years being the fire. You walk into proud halls, and you lay down your token, and you make whole worlds kneel, and you have never once stood underneath it, and so, you do not know what you are. You think you are champions. You think the challenge is honor. You think you measure the worth of a world by sending one ship to fight one ship in the watching dark. But you are not the dark's champions. You are a smaller fire that has never met the larger one. And the larger one is still out there, past your charts, past your ribbon, in the quarter you never bothered to map. It does not challenge. It does not parlay. And one day it will find you, and it will look at your 211,000 warships and your 9,000-year law, and it will not see champions. It will see a field. I am here, the last tribute said, because 41 worlds knelt to you, and they remember it. And they are doing the arithmetic, and they are counting their hulls against yours. And your counsel is right to be afraid, because the challenge was always a bluff and bluffs end. When yours ends, there will be a war, a true war, the kind your law was built to prevent, and it will burn 1,000 worlds, and at the end of it, your ascendancy will be so weakened and so small that when the tide comes, there will be no one left who remembers how to turn it off. And the galaxy will be a field, and the fire will eat it, and there will be no green world left that learned patience the hard way to come and stand in anyone's sky and say welcome. So I came, the last tribute said, not to win your challenge, not to refuse it, to end it. To be the last tribute any world ever pays to the ascendancy, and to make the ending so plain that even the fire can understand it. And Garrick Vale, who had come to die so a lie could live, who had spent 340 years certain that he had measured the whole of the dark, looked at the small gray ship that weighed everything, and he asked the only question left. He asked, how? How do you end a thing 9,000 years old, without burning the 1,000 worlds you came to save? And the last tribute said, the same way I ended the tide, gently. And then it told him what it needed from the hand that never loses, and it was not a thing any champion of the ascendancy had ever been asked for, and Garrick Vale listened to all of it, and at the end, he was quiet for a long while. What the last tribute asked, in those quiet moments on the bridge of the verdict, was not a thing the old champion could agree to lightly, and so he made it explain itself fully, the way he had made 41 worlds explain themselves before he ended them, except that now, he was the one being asked to understand. He asked it the hard questions. He asked what would happen to the 41 worlds he had made kneel, whether they would rise and burn the ascendancy the moment the bluff was gone. And the last tribute said, that depends entirely on whether the ascendancy spends the next 10 years being a fire or learning to be a field, and that is not my choice to make. It is yours and your counsel's, and I cannot save you from it. I can only make the choice plain. He asked what would happen to the 211,000 warships, whether they would be useless now, whether the ascendancy would be defenseless when the larger fire came. And the last tribute said, a fleet is not useless to a field, A fleet is the field's hands, but only once the field has decided it would rather build than burn, and a fleet that has only ever burned has a great deal to unlearn, and not much time. He asked, last of all, the question he most needed answered, the one that had kept him from sleeping for 9 days. He asked, "Why me? Why show this to me, when you broke the Spear's crew with the same showing, and they came home silent?" And the last tribute said, "I did not break the Spear's crew. I let them go, and being let go was more than their minds could hold, because they had never let anyone go in their lives, and did not know it could be done. I did not let go. You I am asking to carry something. That is a different thing entirely. A creature that is spared has been made smaller, made to understand it was at the mercy of a thing it cannot fight. A creature that is asked to carry something has been made larger, made part of the thing it cannot fight. I am not sparing you, champion. I am recruiting you, and I am recruiting you because you asked a question, and in 9,000 years you are the only one who did, and a thing that asks instead of demands is the only thing in all the inner dark that the dark might yet be saved by." Then Garrick Vale said, "You understand that if I do this, I will be the traitor in every song the Ascendancy ever sings again. The champion who knelt, the hand that finally lost." And the last tribute said, "No, you will be the only champion who ever stood underneath the token instead of behind it, and lived, and chose the field over the fire. The songs will not understand it for 1,000 years, but the worlds will be alive to sing them. That is the only kind of victory there is. Everything else is just a fire telling itself a story about honor while it eats." Garrick Vale looked at Tovesh, his old censor chief, 19 challenges of her own, and at the 109 others on his bridge and his decks, every one of them a champion who had come to stand with him one last time. And he saw that they had heard all of it, every word, because the last tribute had let them, and that not one of them had reached for a weapon, and that the thing in their faces was no longer the empty look of certainty taken away. It was something being put in the empty place. Something he had no name for, because the Ascendancy had never built a word for it, because you cannot name a thing you have spent 9,000 years pretending does not exist. It was the look of a fire learning, for the first time, that it had always been afraid of the dark. What the last tribute had asked of Garrick Vale was very simple, and it was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. It had asked him to carry the truth home. Not a refusal, not a defeat, the truth. It had asked the hand that never loses to return to the Hall of Challenges, to stand before the 12 oldest minds in the Ascendancy, and to tell them, in front of the open challenge band, that every species in the charted dark kept always listening, exactly what he had seen. The green world, the 4 billion dead, the tide that did not parley, the smaller fire and the larger fire, the arithmetic the 41 worlds were already doing, and then to lay down, not the iron token, but the iron token's meaning, the whole 9,000-year machine, and to say plainly that it was over, that the challenge had always been a bluff, and that the only thing the Ascendancy could do now, to save its 1,000 worlds from the coming war and the coming tide, was to stop being a fire and learn, before it was too late, how to be patient. The council would not believe him. That was the whole difficulty. A frightened crew could be hidden, a silent spear could be explained away, but the hand that never loses, the champion of 206 challenges, returning from the small loud world, not silent, but speaking, not broken but changed, telling the Ascendancy to lay down its law, that the council could not survive, and so the council would call him a coward, a traitor, a hull that had been turned by the enemy, and they would try to bury him, and bury the truth with him, and the bluff would limp on for another year, or another decade, until the arithmetic finished and the war came. Unless the truth was made too large to bury, and that was the part the last tribute would handle. That was the part it had crossed the long empty quarter to do. It would come with him, not behind the ribbon, hidden, the way the Ascendancy hid its shadow fleets. It would come openly, in his sky, all 22 kilometers of it, weighing everything, measurable by no instrument, and it would hang above the Hall of Challenges, where every species in the inner dark could see it, and it would do to the Great Hall what it had done to the Verdict's Bridge. It would turn the lights off, gently, all of them. The whole hollow-ringed station, the heart of the 9,000-year law, the place where 41 worlds had been judged and ruled, and then it would turn them back on, and in doing so it would say, without a single shot, without a single death, the only sentence that could end the bluff. It would say, this is how easily it could have been the other way, for 9,000 years. And we never came. Garrick Vale turned the verdict of the ninth spire toward home, and the last tribute came with him, openly. The two ships crossing the long empty quarter together, the old etched Vorthan war steel, and the patient gray thing that had once been a green world. They crossed the ribbon. The crew of the verdict changed in those 9 days. Garrick watched it happen. He had brought 110 champions out to the small loud world, the finest the dying art of the challenge had ever made, every one of them certain of the shape of the universe, and he was bringing home 110 creatures who had stood underneath the token and seen the green world burn one street at a time. Old Drev at the guns, who had not missed a firing solution in 200 years, came to Garrick on the 4th day and asked, quietly, to have the gunnery duty taken from him, not out of fear, but because he had looked at the gray ship beside them and understood that there was nothing left in the dark that his guns were the right answer to, and he wanted to spend the rest of the voyage learning what the right answer might be instead. Sashka, the young navigator, who had begged to see the edge of the charted dark, sat at the forward viewports for hours each watch, looking back the way they had come, at the small loud world shrinking behind them, and once Garrick found her there, with her hand pressed flat to the cold port, and she did not look around, and she said, "Only 4 billion, sir," as though she were still trying to fit the figure into a mind that had been built to hold kill marks and not streets. And Tovesh kept the sensors, and watched the gray ship beside them the whole way home, and reported, once each watch, the same impossible reading, the mass that climbed and ran out of numbers, and she had stopped being frightened of it somewhere over the long empty quarter, and had started, instead, to be something the ascendancy had no word for, which was grateful that such a thing existed, and was on the side of the field. And on the 9th day they came into the sky of the Hall of Challenges, the heart of the ascendancy. And Garrick Vale saw what was waiting for them, and he understood that the council had not been idle. The council had not believed the readouts. The council had decided, the way frightened powers always decide, that the readouts were a trick, that the small loud world had built one frightening hull and one frightening transmission and no more, that the silence of the Spear's crew was cowardice, and the strangeness of the instruments was sabotage, and that whatever the hand that never loses came home carrying, it could be drowned, the way everything could be drowned, in enough hulls. So the council had called the fleet, not a shadow fleet hidden behind the ribbon, all of it, every warship the ascendancy could gather in 9 days. 211,000 hulls of etched war steel, the largest gathering in the history of the law, ringed around the Hall of Challenges in 9 great shells. Gun throats open, every one of them aimed at the single gray ship that had dared to come home with the champion who would not lie for them. It was the most warships ever assembled in the charted dark. It was the bluff calling itself. It was 9,000 years of fear made into a wall of steel, the council's last answer to the one thing the council could not survive, which was the truth spoken on the open band. And the last tribute, 22 kilometers of patience, looked at the 211,000 hulls, and it did not slow, and it did not flinch, and it did not put up a single shield that the Holy Nine could find, because there was no shield, because a thing that weighs everything does not need one. Garrick Vale, on the bridge of the verdict, looked at the 9 shells of steel ringing the Hall of Challenges, 211,000 hulls, more warships than had ever gathered in one sky in the whole history of the law, and he understood the council's logic completely, because it had been his own logic for 340 years. When a thing frightens you, and you cannot measure it, you drown it. You bring everything. You make the unmeasurable thing very small by setting it against a number so large that no instrument is needed, because surely, 211,000 hulls is more than any one ship can answer, and the Holy Nine need not report a thing you can simply bury under the largest barrage in history. It was the reasoning of a fire, the only reasoning a fire has, which is that everything can be solved by bringing enough fire. And Garrick Vale, watching, felt a thing he had not expected to feel, which was a kind of grief, because he saw that the council had not understood a single word the Spear's crew had failed to say, had not understood the showing, had not understood the green world, or the tide, or the difference between a fire and a field, and was about to demonstrate, in front of every species in the inner dark, on the open band, the exact thing the last tribute had crossed the long empty quarter to make plain. It said, on the open challenge band, so that every world in the inner dark could hear, I came alone, as your champion came alone to my sky. Will you answer the way he did, or the way you are about to? The council answered the way they were about to. They gave the order. 211,000 hulls fired at once, the largest single barrage in the 9,000-year history of the Ascendancy. Every gun throat in the fleet, enough fire to end 40 worlds, all of it aimed at one gray ship, all of it crossing the dark in the same instant, a wall of war steel and plasma and folded space lances thick enough to be its own weather. And the last tribute turned it off. Not the fire. The fire was already in the dark, already crossing, already real. It turned off the part of the universe that had agreed to let the fire arrive. Garrick Vale, watching from the bridge of the verdict, saw the 211,000 shots cross half the distance to the gray ship, and then, altogether, soft and clean, simply stop being on their way to anywhere. They did not detonate. They did not deflect. They unhappened. The way a number unhappens when the instrument runs out of numbers before the mass runs out, and where the largest barrage in history had been, there was only the dark, and the slow, weak light of the Hall's captured star, and the single gray ship, unmarked, unmoved, weighing everything. Garrick Vale, on the bridge of the verdict, beside the gray ship, watching the largest barrage in the history of the inner dark unhappen in front of his eyes, felt the last of his old certainty go. He had spent 340 years believing that strength was a real thing, a thing you could weigh, a thing the Holy Nine could find, and he had just watched 211,000 warships, the whole fleet of the Ascendancy, throw everything they had at a single gray ship, and the everything had simply been removed from the list of things that were going to happen. There had been no defense. There had been no shield. There had been a thing that weighed everything choosing, in the same gentle motion with which it had turned off the verdict's lights 4 seconds into their first meeting, to decline the barrage's existence. And the council, ringed in its 9 shells of steel, understood it too, in the same instant, every one of them, and the open band carried their silence to 400 listening worlds. And then the last tribute did the thing it had crossed the quarter to do. It turned off the Hall of Challenges, the whole hollow-ringed station, the heart of the law, every light and every gauge and every gun, all together, soft and clean, and the 211,000 hulls of the fleet, ringed around it in 9 great shells, found their own lights going out with it, one shell at a time, gently, not killed, not burned, not even truly disarmed, simply turned off, the way you turn off a child's lamp, the way you turn off a thing that was never as awake as it believed itself to be. 211,000 warships went dark and silent and still in the sky of their own heart, and not one crew was harmed, and not one hull was scratched, and every species in the inner dark, listening on the open band, heard the silence fall over the Ascendancy's greatest gathering, and understood, all at once, everywhere, that the bluff was over. Garrick Vale watched it from the bridge of the verdict, and he had stood in the dark of 206 challenges, and he had never seen a dark like this one. It was not the dark of a battle. There was no fire in it, no wreckage, no screaming bands, no proud voices breaking. It was the dark of a thing that had simply stopped, all at once, gently, 211,000 warships, and the heart of the law, and the gallery of 40 knelt species, all of it gone quiet and still, and lightless in the same soft breath, and the only thing left burning in the whole vast sky was the captured star at the center of the hall, the star the early Ascendancy had hauled out of a dying system 9,000 years ago to prove that it could take and hold anything. It burned its weak, slow light over a fleet that had been switched off, and Garrick Vale looked at it and understood that the message of the hall had just been answered. The Ascendancy had said, "For 9,000 years, we took a star, and we hold it still. What chance have you?" And the gray ship had said, without a word, with only the dark, "You took a star, and I took everything else, and I did not even have to hold it. I only had to set it down, and look, it stays where I set it, because that is what a field does. It sets things down." The captured star burned on, the one light in the dark, and it had never looked, to the old champion, so much like a prisoner, and so little like a trophy. Then the last tribute turned the lights back on. All of them. The hall, the fleet, every gauge. Gently, the way dawn comes up, and it said, on the open band, in the old challenge tongue spoken better than any Vorthan alive, the sentence Garrick Vale had known it would say. It said, this is how easily it could have been the other way, for 9,000 years, and we never came. And then it said the rest, the part for the 41 worlds and the 400 others, and every kneeling world in the charted dark, and the part for the council, and the part, most of all, for the larger fire still out there past the unmapped quarter. It said, your champion stood underneath the token and lived, and he has something to tell you, and you will let him tell it, because you have just seen what I could have done and did not. I did not come to rule you. A field does not want to rule the fire. I came to tell you that the fire is small, and the dark is large, and the thing that will truly come for you does not parley, and does not challenge, and does not leave crews alive to go home silent. You have 9,000 years of practice making worlds kneel. You have no practice at all surviving. Your champion has seen what surviving costs. Listen to him, or do not, but the challenge is ended, here, today, on the open band, in front of everyone, and no world will ever pay you tribute again, because the last tribute has already been paid, and I am it. And the council, in the relit hall, surrounded by 211,000 warships that had just been switched off and on like lamps, looked across the dark at the single gray ship that weighed everything, and they did not give another order, because there was no order left to give. There was no door but the one Garrick Vale had opened when he asked his question. There was only the field, patient and gray and alive, waiting to see whether the fire could learn. The thing that struck the old champion most, in the long quiet after the lights came back, was how little the last tribute had taken. It had crossed the long empty quarter. It had absorbed the largest barrage in the history of the inner dark and made it never have happened. It had switched off the heart of the 9,000-year law and the largest fleet ever gathered, and it had taken nothing. Not a hull, not a world, not a single life, on either side. The 211,000 warships were whole. Their crews were whole. The hall was whole. The captured star at the center of the hall still burned its weak, slow light. The last tribute had done a thing that could have ended the ascendancy in an afternoon, and it had ended only one thing, the only thing it had come to end, which was the bluff, and it had left everything else exactly as it found it, the way a creature that remembers being the field will not take a single grain more than it must, because it knows what taking everything looks like from underneath. Garrick Vale had taken everything from 41 worlds. He had stood on their fields and laid down the iron token and walked away with everything they had ever loved, and he had called it honor, because the law called it honor, and the law was 9,000 years old and he had never thought to ask it a question. And now he stood on the bridge of the verdict of the ninth spire and watched a thing that could have taken everything from him take nothing at all, and he understood, finally and completely, the difference between a fire and a field, and the difference was not strength, and it was not size, and it was not the Holy Nine. The difference was what you did with the moment when you could have taken everything. A fire took it. A field, every time, left the grain in the ground, because a field knew that next year it would need the field to still be a field, and a fire only ever thought about the burning. The last tribute had been the larger thing in every way that the ascendancy measured, and it had behaved like the smaller, gentler thing, and that, Garrick Vale saw, was the whole of the lesson, the thing the Spear's crew had been shown and could not carry, the thing he had been recruited to carry in their place. Power is not what you take. Power is what you decline to take when no one could stop you. And by that measure, the only measure that had ever mattered, the small, loud world out past the ribbon, was the strongest thing in the charted dark, and the ascendancy, for 9,000 years, had been the weakest, and had simply never met anything strong enough to show it. Garrick Vale stood before the 12 oldest minds in the ascendancy, in the relit hall of challenges, with the open band still listening, and the single gray ship still hanging in the sky, and he told them the truth. He told all of it. He did not soften it. He had spent 340 years speaking the words of the law, 206 times, never once heard answered, and he found that when at last he spoke something that was not the law, the words came easily, the way water comes easily once the ice breaks. He told them about the green world. He told them about the 4 billion dead in a single turn of a world around its star, harvested without hatred, without honor, without the small mercy of an enemy who wants you to kneel. He told them about the 4,000 years the survivors had spent becoming a thing with no shelf. And he told them that he had felt his own failing heart stop for the length of the showing, and that this, the stopping, was the truest thing that had ever happened to him. Because for the length of it, he had stood underneath the token instead of behind it, and he had finally understood what he was. He told them the arithmetic. He named the 41 worlds he himself had made kneel, by name, each of them, and he said that they were counting their hulls now, all of them, and that the counting would not stop, and that the bluff that had held the ascendancy together for 9,000 years was already cracking in 41 throne halls, and would crack in 400 more before the next turn of the year. He told them that the only future in which the ascendancy's 1,000 worlds were still alive in a century was the one in which the ascendancy stopped being a fire today, on the open band, in front of everyone, and admitted what it was, and began, however late, to learn how to survive the thing that was still out there, past the unmapped quarter, the larger fire, the one that did not parley. The council heard him. They had no choice but to hear him, because 211,000 warships had just been switched off and on around them, and because every species in the inner dark was listening, and because the hand that never loses, the one voice in the ascendancy that 9,000 years of victory had made impossible to call a coward, was the one speaking. They could not bury him. The truth had been made too large to bury. That was the gift the last tribute had given him, the only gift it had given anyone in 9,000 years, that was not the gift of being spared. It had made the truth too large to bury, and then it had stepped back and let an old champion carry it. Because a truth carried by one of their own was a truth the ascendancy could survive, and a truth delivered by the enemy was only another fire. The eldest of the council, a creature older even than Garrick Vale, who had judged challenges before Garrick was born, listened to all of it, and at the end, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the only question the council had left. She asked, "What does it want?" The gray ship, if it does not want to rule us, if it does not want tribute, if it does not want to win, what does it want? Nothing in the charted dark wants nothing. And Garrick Vale answered for the last tribute, because he had asked it the same question in his own sky, and he carried the answer the way he carried everything now, plainly. He said, "It wants there to be someone left to sing the songs. It wants the dark to have more than one green world in it that learned patience the hard way. It wants, when the larger fire finally comes, for there to be a galaxy that knows how to turn it off, instead of a graveyard that forgot. It does not want to rule the field. It wants the field to be alive, that is all. It is the strangest want I have ever met, and I have met 206 champions and 41 kneeling worlds, and not one of them ever wanted anything but to win, and that is why we are a fire, and that is why we were going to die, and that is why I am standing here telling you to stop." The council did not answer that day. The council was 9,000 years old and could not turn in a single turn, but the open band had heard everything, and so had the 41 worlds, and so had the 400, and so had every kneeling world in the charted dark, and the thing that had been switched off in the sky of the Hall of Challenges was not the fleet, and was not the lights. It was the bluff. And a bluff, once switched off in front of everyone, does not come back on. The news of it ran through the inner dark faster than any ship could carry it, because the open band carried it instantly, and every kneeling world had heard the silence fall over the ascendancy's greatest gathering, and had understood, all at once, the thing the council had spent 9,000 years making sure no one would understand. The first to understand were the 41, Garrick Vale's own worlds, the ones whose names were etched on the bow of the verdict, the ones he had made kneel with the iron token and a sentence. They had spent generations paying their tribute and sending their young to the arena schools and calling the thing that ruled them honor, and now they had watched, on the open band, a single gray ship absorb the whole fleet of their masters and switch it off like a lamp and take nothing, and they had heard their own champion, the hand that never loses, stand in the heart of the ascendancy and tell the truth. And here was the thing the council had most feared, And the thing that did not happen, the 41 did not rise. They did not gather their hidden fleets, the ones they had been quietly building against the day the bluff broke, and fall on the weakened ascendancy to take back everything that had been taken from them. They had heard the rest of Garrick's words too. They had heard about the larger fire, the tide, the harvester that did not parley, the things still out there past the unmapped quarter, and the smartest among them, the ones who had spent generations under the ascendancy's hand, learning patience the slow, bitter way that the conquered always learn it, did the same arithmetic the last tribute had done, and arrived at the same answer. A war now, a true war, the kind the challenge had been built to prevent, would burn 1,000 worlds and leave the survivors so small and so scattered that when the tide came, there would be no one left who remembered how to turn it off. The 41 had been taught patience by the very power they hated, and now, in the strangest turn the inner dark had ever taken, that patience was the thing that saved the ascendancy from the consequences of its own 9,000 years. The conquered chose not to burn their conquerors, because a gray ship had shown all of them, at once, that there was a larger fire coming, and that the only ones who would survive it were the ones who learned, before it arrived, to be a field. The challenge ended that year, not in war, not in conquest. It simply stopped, the way a fire stops when there is nothing left it is allowed to eat, the way a thing stops being holy the moment everyone watching understands at once that it was always only a story, a fire told itself about honor. The 41 worlds did not rise against the ascendancy, because there was nothing left to rise against. The iron tokens were not thrown down. They were quietly set aside, all of them, in halls across 1,000 worlds, and where there had been a law that made the dark kneel there was now only a wound where the law had been, and the slow, strange work of building something in the empty place. Something the ascendancy had never built. Something it had no word for. It was not easy, and it was not quick, and the old champion did not pretend afterward that it had been. The first years were the hardest. A power that has been a fire for 9,000 years does not become a field because a gray ship switched off its lights one afternoon. There were factions in the council who argued, for a long time, that the whole thing had been a trick, that the gray ship had no larger fire behind its stories, that the ascendancy should rebuild the bluff, send out new challengers, etch new marks, pretend the small, loud world had never come. They were not stupid, the ones who argued this. They were only afraid, in the way that a creature is afraid when the one thing it knows how to do is suddenly the wrong thing, and there is nothing yet to put in its place. Garrick Vale argued them down, year after year, because he was the one voice they could not call a coward, and because he had stood underneath the token and seen the green world burn one street at a time, and could describe it to them until they could not unsee it either. He spent the strength of his last decades on the council floor, doing the only thing harder than winning a challenge, which was unmaking the very idea of the challenge in the minds of the creatures who had built their whole worth around it. And slowly, the way a field grows, which is too slowly to watch, but fast enough to feed a world, it began to take. The arena schools, where the young had been sent for 9,000 years to learn the cold art of ending other worlds, began to teach something else. The fleets, the 211,000 hulls, were not scrapped, because a field needs hands, but they stopped going out to lay down tokens, and started going out to chart the long empty quarter, the part of the dark the ascendancy had never bothered to map, looking for the larger fire before it could come looking for them. The tribute the 41 worlds had paid for generations was not demanded any longer, and most of the 41, in the strangest mercy the inner dark had ever seen, kept paying a part of it anyway, not as tribute now, but as their share of the cost of charting the dark, because they too had heard about the tide, and a world that has learned patience the hard way does not need to be told twice that a larger fire is coming. The last tribute did not stay to oversee it. A field does not rule the fire. It hung in the sky of the Hall of Challenges for one more day, weighing everything, measurable by no instrument, and then it spoke once more on the open band, to all of them, and it said only this. It said, "You have a long way to go, and not much time, and we will not do it for you. We did ours alone, in our own ash, and so will you. But the band stays open. If the larger fire comes before you are ready, call on it, the way no world ever dared call on you, and we will hear it, because we remember being the field, and a field that survived does not let another field burn. if it can stand in the sky and say welcome. That is the whole of what we are. We are the welcome that the dark never gave us, given to you, who never deserved it, because deserving was a fire's idea, and we are done with fires. Learn patience, sing the songs, stay alive. That is the only challenge that was ever real. And then the last tribute turned, all 22 kilometers of it, and crossed the long, empty quarter back toward the small, loud world out past the ribbon, and the Holy Nine watched the mass reading climb and run out of numbers. And then the gray ship was gone, and the sky of the Hall of Challenges was only a sky again, ringed with 211,000 warships that no longer knew what they were for. Garrick Vale did not go back to the slag moon of Hesh. The Council, in the slow years that followed, found that it needed him, the one champion who had stood underneath the token and lived, the one voice that could speak the new strange wants on the open band and be believed. He was 340 years old, and then he was 350, and his failing heart failed a little more each year, but he stayed, because he had finally been surprised, and the hunger that woke in the hollow hall had not gone back to sleep. He spent his last years teaching a fire how to be patient. It was the hardest challenge of his life, harder than all 206 together, and he did not win it, because it could not be won, only begun, and beginning it was enough. He lived to be 361, which was very old even for a Vorthan, and the medics said it was the new work that kept the failing heart going, the strange late purpose of teaching a fire to be a field, because a creature with a thing left to do does not let go of it easily. In his last year, when he could no longer cross the hall on his own, and was carried to the council floor in a chair, he had a single request, and the council, which had learned by then to refuse him nothing, granted it. He asked to be taken to the great chart room, where the fleets brought back everything they had found in the long empty quarter, the part of the dark the Ascendancy had spent 9,000 years refusing to map, and had now spent 10 years mapping with everything it had. And he sat in his chair before the growing chart, the wall of slowly filling dark, and he looked at the far edge of it, the part still empty, the part where the larger fire waited, and he did not look afraid. The young officers who tended the chart room said afterward that the hand that never loses sat before the unmapped dark for a long while, and then he said, "To no one, the dark is not so large that a patient enough field cannot learn it." And then he asked them to open the chart band, the working frequency the fleets used among themselves, and he said one thing into it, for all the charting crews scattered across the quarter to hear, and the thing he said was, "Keep mapping, the welcome is real, I have seen it, stay alive." And those were the last orders the old champion ever gave, and they were not the orders of a fire. He died in the chart room, in the chair, looking at the empty edge of the dark, and the medics said the failing heart simply finished, all at once, gently, the way a thing finishes when there is nothing left, it is allowed to eat. The council buried him not on the slag moon of Hesh, with the worlds he had ended, as the old custom would have had it, but in the Hall of Challenges itself, beneath the captured star, in the exact place where he had stood, and told the truth, and they set above him not the 7-syllable title that meant, "hand that never loses," because that was the name of a fire, but a single new word in the Vorthan tongue that had not existed before that decade, a word the council had been forced to coin for the thing the Ascendancy was slowly learning to be. The word meant, as near as the old tongue could carry it, one who stood underneath, and learned. It was the first new word the Vorthan had made in 9,000 years, and it was made for him, and it was true. Tovesh, his old censor chief, 19 challenges of her own, kept the open band. That was the work she asked for, and the council gave it to her, because no one else wanted the seat that listened for a fire larger than the dark could hold. She sat at it for the rest of her life, and most days there was nothing, only the long quiet of a galaxy slowly learning a new shape. But once a year, on the day the last tribute had switched the hall off and on, and ended the challenge, she would key the open band, and send a single word out across the long empty quarter, toward the small loud world she had been sent to destroy, and had been taught, instead, to survive. The word was not a challenge, it was not a boast. It was the word the gray ship had answered her champion with, in the first 4 seconds, before any of them understood what they were looking at. She sent the word, "Welcome." And every year, across the long empty quarter, past the ribbon, from the small loud world that weighed everything, and feared nothing, the last tribute answered. One word, sent back the long way, taking the better part of a day to cross the dark, arriving faint and certain in the ears of an old Vorthan who had once gone to war against the thing that had taught her what war was for. She was not the only one who sent it, by the end. The thing about the open band was that everyone could hear it, and so everyone heard Tovesh send her word each year, and everyone heard the field answer, and slowly, the way a custom grows, the other worlds began to send it too. The 41, first, the ones Garak had made kneel, who had the most reason to hate the ascendancy, and had chosen instead to learn from the thing that ended its law. They sent the word on the same day, from their own skies, and the small loud world answered each of them in turn, taking days, sometimes, to send all the answers back across the dark, and never missing one. Then the 400 sent it. Then worlds the ascendancy had never even challenged, worlds far out toward the edge of the inner dark that had only heard the story second-hand, and had understood it anyway, because the thing the last tribute had shown that day in the hall was a thing any field could understand, conquered or free, large or small. By the end of Tovesh's long life, there were thousands of skies that sent the word welcome out into the long, empty quarter once a year, on the day the challenge ended, and thousands of times the small, loud world answered, and the open band, which had been built 9,000 years ago so that no world could ever claim it had not heard the words of the law, carried instead, now, a galaxy slowly teaching itself to say welcome to the dark, and to hear the dark, for the first time in its history, answer back. The word it sent back was, always, here. And that was how the 9,000-year law of the Vorthan ascendancy ended. Not with the largest barrage in history, which simply unhappened. Not with the fall of 211,000 hulls, which were only switched off and on like lamps and harmed not at all. Not with the death of a single crew on a single ship on either side. It ended with an old champion who asked a question instead of making a demand, and a gray ship that had once been a green world, and had crossed the long empty quarter not to win, and not to rule, but to make sure there would be someone left to sing, and a single word sent once a year across the dark, between a fire that was learning to be patient, and the field that had finally taught it how. No empire ever challenged the last tribute, not because they were afraid of its guns, for it never fired one, not because of its size, though it was 22 kilometers long and twice the length of anything in the charted dark. They never challenged it because they had all seen, on the open band, in front of everyone, the one thing a fire can never unsee. They had seen a thing that could have ended them all, gently, in an afternoon, look at the largest fleet ever gathered, and choose instead to turn the lights off and on, and say welcome. You do not challenge that. You do not measure it. You do not file it on any shelf the dark has ever built. You learn from it, if you are very lucky, and very old, and brave enough to ask the question first. And then you keep the band open, and you wait, and once a year you send the word out into the long empty quarter, and you listen, in the quiet of a galaxy that is finally, slowly, learning to stay alive, for the field to answer the fire. Here, it answers, always, here.